Coming up on This Week in Computer Hardware, Intel's Haswell CPU and a dog pile as the A7 motherboards benchmarked, AMD Richland reviewed, Computex, oh, so many products, new MacBooks coming, and more. It's all coming up next on Twitch.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Twitch is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 221, recorded June 6th, 2013. Skip Haswell?
This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by Ting.com. Ting is a new mobile phone service that makes sense. Save money with Ting. Pay for what you use, does not require a contract, and offers unlimited devices on one pooled plan. To save $25 on your first Ting device, visit twitch.ting.com. That's twitch.ting.com.
Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, Twitch's weekly show that aims to bring you the best, most useful, and most, well, perky hardware news around there. Whether we're talking PCs, laptops, tablets, and occasionally consoles and phones. Well, look, folks, mostly Ryan Shrout and I. Are you there, Ryan?
I am here. I'm ready on board. It was a busy week. It was a busy week in hardware news. Computex tends to do that, right? So it
was like 700 series GPUs from NVIDIA, followed by like Haswell, followed by like Computex. And if you've never heard of Computex, it's what Comdex used to be in the United States, except it's in Taiwan. It is, and just mobile and CPU parts and cases and just about everything but hard drives. And we have a hard drive announcement this week from Western Digital. But where do you want to start? Do you want to start with Haswell this week, Ryan?
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest. That's probably the biggest launch of the week. We've talked about 780 and 770. Luckily, we got those a couple of weeks in advance from NVIDIA. But Computex also marks the launch of the completely new processor architecture from Intel, Haswell. We've talked about it a lot on the show from an architecture standpoint, so I don't think we really need to dive too much into that again. The general consensus is the x86 part of the CPU is a little bit faster. There's some improvements in memory architecture. There's some improvements in the actual execution cores. There's new ISA extensions like AVX2 that are very similar to kind of what we saw happen with SSE and SSE2 and that kind of stuff, just expanding it to handle larger, longer, wider bits of instructions for multimedia use cases. On the GPU side, we do see a bigger improvement. Even if we only focus on the desktop parts, we find that the HD 4600, which is what is in the 4770K, the Core i7 4770K, it's about 20 to 25%, 15 to 25% faster than the Ivy Bridge graphics, right? Which is a plus.
Right.
But otherwise, the CPU is very similar to what we know of in Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge already. So it's not a drastic change, but it is a whole new platform, new chipset, new motherboard, new socket, all that kind of stuff is required for that.
The big thing I think probably for people that are thinking about upgrading this is a significant performance upgrade over the Ivy Bridge CPUs, and B is the legendary. Intel's basically claiming a 50% boost in performance based on some of the exciting stuff they're doing with power states and reduced power consumption on the CPU. As far as we know right now, nobody has a Haswell-based laptop for testing available, so we can't verify the battery life on that. There's definitely a reduction in power use on the desktop part, and mostly Haswell seems to really be about power consumption, the reduction of power consumption, the improvement of graphics, not so much the improvement of just core CPU like raw power.
Yeah, like the clock rate isn't going up. The IPC, there is an IPC improvement, which is instructions per clock, which is kind of, if you look at our review at PCPer.com, you'll see a page that looks at Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge, and Haswell all running at exactly 3.5 gigahertz. And it kind of gives you the ability to see what architecturally has changed from one generation to the next. And it's kind of interesting there. Like I said, you're getting anywhere from 5 to 10% of that. Plus it runs maybe 100 megahertz faster or something, right? Nothing too drastic there. It's actually, I do want to point out on the desktop side, it actually uses a little bit more power. The Haswell parts have an 85 watt TDP, 84 watt TDP, and the Ivy Bridge was 77. So it actually went up a little bit with Haswell, and you know the reason that's the case, it's not something that they wanted to do, but they built Haswell from the ground up to be a low power part, right? You were talking about battery life improvements on mobile technology or like laptops and tablets and that kind of stuff. And that's really what they were targeting with it. And kind of as a side result to that, when they went to go take that architecture and build the consumer desktop versions, they turned out, okay, to get the same kind of similar improvement in performance that we saw going from Sandy to Ivy, we actually have to rebump up the TDP a little bit. You know, it's not much. 85 watt TDP for a high-end processor is not high. Right. AMD's processors are, like, if you look at the FX 8350, I think that's still like 120 watts or something like that. So still quite a bit higher. It uses more or less power at idle, depending on what motherboard you're using, as it turns out. But under a load, it's pretty consistently, 10, 15 watts more on the power consumption side.
Almost sounds like a Monty Python skit. It uses more and less power. Is that based on so it's the motherboard and the motherboard settings, or just the motherboard?
It's how the motherboard vendor integrated certain processor features, essentially, right? So I think it's something that will even out over time, but because it's the first generation and it's the first firmware releases from all these places, there's some variance back and forth in terms of what idle states, what sleep states they actually utilize, what capabilities they have to disable I/O features and that kind of thing to turn down idle power consumption to its minimum. It's not really that important on the desktop, right? The difference between 49 watts idle and 53 watts idle is not a big deal, even if you're running a home theater PC that's sitting there on all the time. That's not really that big of a deal. But on the notebook side, that is a big deal. And they're obviously much more careful about what happens to the power delivery on the notebook side.
Asus ROG Republic of Gamers Maximus 6 Extreme motherboard, the Asus Griffin Z87 Tough Micro ATX motherboard, and the MSI Z87 GD65 gaming motherboard. Guess which one of those companies is paying more attention to marketing? Well, which of those two companies? Are there any clear leaders? I mean, what's the average price for a Z87 motherboard, the motherboard you're going to need if you want to run a Haswell CPU? And obviously, like 6 gigabit per second SATA ports across the board, tons of USB 3.0 ports. Thunderbolt, not standard, but optional on many, or available on many of these motherboards. And your overclocking article on PC Per, I just love how easy overclocking keeps getting. Just when you think it can't get any easier, it's just as easy as it was. And what do you think? I mean? Are there any clear like motherboards that you're just cuddling at night before you go to bed?
Not really. I think the problem for me is that there's so many of them out there. The Z87 platforms are going to have the same price ranges that you saw in Z77. So you're going to be able to buy a board for $130 if you want the minimal amount of features, and you can buy a board for $350 if you want like that one, the Maximus 6 Extreme with the external overclocking panel and that kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, you can get all the bells and whistles that you want. I would say that, Maury is kind of the guy who's handling all the motherboards. He probably has a stack of 9 or 10 Z87 boards yet to be tested, sitting on his desk. So, I feel for him there. But we had Asus come out and do a live stream with us where JJ, representative from the company, came out and brought literally like 22 different motherboards with him. And we kind of walked through what are the differences here? What are you actually paying for when you upgrade? They were very adamant about, seeing things like your overclocking experience will be very similar, even from the 160 board compared to the $320 board. It just depends on what features you want in between, things like that. It's kind of an interesting world, again, because performance of motherboards is almost not really an issue, especially if we look at if you're looking at benchmarks and CPU tests, memory tests, anything like that. They don't matter in motherboards. They really don't. It comes down to who has better software, better feature implementation, better BIOS implementation, that kind of stuff. I mean, they ran a demo with a high-end air cooler on a well-binned Haswell part, I will say, where their software does, like, you know, increases some stuff, runs a test, increases some stuff, runs a test, all hands off, and then when it finally crashes, it reboots and it does some more stuff, and then it crashes again, and then it reboots and it doesn't. It's all part of the process. And we got a Haswell 4770K up to 4.8 gigahertz just through the automated fashion, right? Where we didn't have to go in and tweak anything, but you could use that as a starting point. There's the overclocking on Haswell is very different than there was on Ivy Bridge. It gets a lot hotter, a lot quicker, as is kind of evident by that TDP increase, right? The TDP increase at the same frequency lets you know that as you increase that frequency, things are going to continue to ramp up, right? It's not a straight curve. It's going to go up some, right? So when I did my overclocking for the review, you know, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3 gigahertz, no big deal. When we hit 4.5 gigahertz, we were in the 80 C range, 80 degrees Celsius. And when we went 4.6 gigahertz, we were like in the 91, 92 degrees C range. And that's really, really high, much higher than what Ivy Bridge and much higher than what Sandy Bridge was at those same voltages and same frequencies. So, you know, there are some downsides to Intel tweaking the processor for, you know, having the same architecture in a 9-watt part as they are in an 84-watt part, right? There's some trade-offs that have to happen there. But the motherboards themselves are very robust. If you get Asus, MSI, or Gigabyte, there are a ton of options out there, and they've had plenty of time to work on and tweak and perfect the boards that are out there. So, you know, take a look around. We'll be posting reviews on PCPro.com on like probably a couple of week basis for the next forever, until we kind of get through this backlog, because all the vendors were just ready with tons of boards. So,
Dr. Mac posts in the chat room, guess that Haswell motherboards will include SSUSB and Thunderbolt version 2.0, right? No. Thunderbolt 2.0 was just announced at Computex this week.
Now you can there are there are 2 motherboards from Asus that I know of that have that, and one from Gigabyte, at least I don't know about on MSI, that use that 20 gigabit controller. I think it was called Cactus Ridge. I don't know what its name was before. Thunderbolt 2 is just a name they announced for it at Computex because I don't really know why they did. But it's faster. It's faster, but it's not built into the chipset. It's not, you know, which would be a really cool thing to help lower cost and get more people into the Thunderbolt ecosystem. But it's still an add-on. You know, you do move from 4 to 6 USB 3.0 ports, so that's something. And like you mentioned earlier, you go from 2 SATA 6G to 6 SATA 6G ports on Z87. So there are some improvements there. They're just not overly dramatic.
So, I mean, how do you end up? I mean, obviously Asus has a lot of time to think about this leading up to a new processor and chipset release. How do you end up with 22 distinct motherboards with so little to work with in terms of differentiation, the physical differentiation of the parts? I mean, if you know, it's really interesting to see somebody who deals with that every day kind of describe the difference. Like, I think in our discussions, we started at the Asus Z87A motherboard, which is, you know, bare bones in terms of it has the minimal amount of PCI Express slots. It had 2 legacy PCI slots, used only the chipset-based SATA ports and USB ports, and it used a kind of a basic Ethernet controller. You step up a couple of more iterations, and now you're talking about, you know, an extra SATA controller. You're talking about Intel-based Ethernet, like Intel controller-based Ethernet. You're talking about no more PCI slots, and then more PCIe slots. You step up a couple more, you add in things like a PLX chip for quad SLI support, Thunderbolt support. Now you're talking 10 or 12 SATA connections, dual gigabit Ethernet Intel controllers. So they do a very good job of kind of segmenting it. What we tried to do in those videos that we posted this week is allow people to see that, right? And then you get into, they have their other series of boards, the Tough series, that are built with higher life rated chokes and caps and MOSFETs and that kind of thing. They have braces on the back of them to try to keep them from flexing and that kind of stuff, and dust removal technology. And then you get into their ROG line, which is their super high-end gaming segment, and that kind of stuff, where you get things like the overclocking remote control, essentially, things like that help
differentiate all these products, but it can be very daunting if you're like, oh, I'm going to buy 4770K. What motherboard should I get? And then you're not even limiting yourself to one vendor. Now you've got a dozen or more boards that fit in your price range from each vendor, and now it's entirely confusing. So it really comes down to reading reviews on websites like us or HardOCP or wherever, and then going on to Newegg and going on to Amazon and seeing what feedback you get from different products there.
There you have it. AMD A10 6800K and A10 6700 review. Richland finally lands. What's the scoop, man?
Richland is Trinity APU with a little bit more performance, I guess, across the board, right? So it's literally the same architecture as Trinity. So it's quad-core AMD Bulldozer-based CPU, and then your Radeon graphics cores in there as well to make it an APU. And it's, I'm trying to think how many, 384 Radeon cores, that's what it is. So you got a quad-core processor, 6 GPU SIMD units, and it's the same as Trinity. They were able to do some things to improve power management, which allowed them to get more frequency out of it at the same power level, and also to run at lower power levels at the same, or run at higher performance at the same power levels. Maybe I said that backwards. Either way, they can scale up and now they can scale down a little bit. They've done some more monitoring on the chip for turbo core technology and that kind of stuff. So they're able to scale up and down a little bit quicker, a little bit more granularly. And, you know, it doesn't really change much in the grand scheme of things. As a processor, Richland is still far, far behind Haswell in terms of CPU performance. And GPU performance, it is ahead, right? It's faster than Haswell. Not nearly as much as we were able to say against like Sandy Bridge when APUs first started launching. Intel is starting to catch up, but there's still a healthy 20%, 30% difference between what AMD is able to push out and what Intel is able to push out, and that is with an inferior CPU architecture. So you know the GPU portion is making up for some of the downfall of the CPU side. You know, the only other kind of saving grace for the APU is that it's incredibly cheap. I think the brand new A10 6800K, let me double check here, is I think it's only like $169 or something like that. Which, yeah, about $159 actually. So it's really, really cheap. And you can get boards for really cheap, like 85 bucks if you want. And so you're getting, you know, a really kind of modest mainstream gaming machine, and you can do some pretty basic stuff with that. And if OpenCL takes off, then the whole idea of the APU becomes more attractive. We're seeing more and more applications use OpenCL. Adobe, Photoshop, and Premiere are going to use OpenCL. So, you know, we'll be able to do some more head-to-head comparison testing of what AMD is doing versus what Intel's doing in that OpenCL regard too. So it's a modest upgrade for people that want to stay in the AMD ecosystem, and it's socket compatible. You know, it'll work on all the motherboards that you've got already for the FM2 socket. So that's a plus over what Haswell, you know, is doing this week. It's just not going to make up ground on the CPU front, but still a good part.
Well, I mean, at this point, are we looking at it as a good home, you know, a great choice for a home theater PC, or is it just Haswell, less performance than Haswell, more GPU performance than the Haswell, and at a similar price or a lower price?
It's definitely a lower price.
Okay.
I mean, I think on the last page of my Haswell review, I did a performance per dollar metric, and both the FX 8350 Vishera core and the A10 5800K, which was the Trinity part, the one that I had in order to review because it came out a couple days earlier, were much better performance per dollar than Haswell or Sandy Bridge or Ivy Bridge, and especially something like Sandy Bridge E. The problem is that doesn't really take into account the raw metrics there. Yeah, so we're showing up the graph there, and you can see if you scroll down just a little bit, so you can see at the bottom two scores are the AMD parts, and they're actually higher is better in this graph. It's actually an improvement to see you know, the A10 5800K and the FX 8350 are actually running ahead of most of the Intel parts, and that's what they have to do to compete. That's what they have to do just to make their parts seem relevant to people who do have at least a somewhat concern about single-threaded CPU performance, right? Which is where AMD falls behind. You said it right when you said Haswell has a much faster CPU, but they have a slower GPU. So it depends on what you're looking for. If you're just looking for a small form factor PC for everyday computing, Haswell is going to be a better choice. If you're looking for one that maybe does mainstream gaming, then probably Trinity or Richland now is going to be the better choice.
On the monitor front, we have some exciting announcement at Computex. The drool, that little sort of drooly noise hitting the desk sound you hear is Ryan thinking about the Asus PQ321. It's 31.5-inch 4K monitor. UCAN has all the pixels, like 35 millimeters thin, and an interesting collection of inputs on that. Let me pull up the article again up at PC Per. Because if memory serves, it's not just DisplayPort. Let's do the specs. 31.5-inch display and a 16:9 aspect ratio. Indium gallium zinc oxide, the legendary IGZO panels are going to be rolling out in force this year. 3840 by 2160 resolution, 10-bit RGB, 176-degree viewing angle, horizontal and vertical. Decent, not spectacular brightness, 350 candelas per meter squared, 8 millisecond response time. And the I/O DisplayPort, 2x HDMI, which is optional, RS-232C, 3.5 millimeter audio in and out. It's going to be interesting because you're saying, I think you were saying, Ryan, that Asus confirmed that this was supporting 60 hertz, probably over dual HDMI and over DisplayPort.
At least over the DisplayPort 1.2 connection, and I think over dual HDMI, although that's not an optimal configuration because that requires driver graphics card kind of custom support, right? It's basically seeing it as two separate displays that it merges the images on. But otherwise, I mean, you're talking about, it's a $4,000 display, 31.5 inches, so 32-inch, whatever you want to call it. Pretty nice.
$1
I'm impressed. Yeah. What do they have? The 140 pixels per inch. I don't know what that is like in for other displays and that kind of thing. But you know, I just really want to see these monitors tested. They also announced a 39-inch version of the 4K display as well. So no information on pricing or availability on that one that I saw. But I mean, this 4K monitor is going to be available very soon, like the end of this month. I was being told that the samples are already showing up in the U.S. office in San Jose. So it's, you know, Asus is one of those companies that maybe some people don't think of as being a big player in the display market, but they're actually much larger than you probably realize. In the 1080p displays and that kind of stuff going forward, they make a lot of really high quality displays used in the professional markets as well, and they make pretty much everything across the board. I mean, they've dipped their hands into everything. And this 4K monitor looks impressive. The PQ321. Plus, it's an easy to remember name, which I'm a fan of.
Are you a fan of the GTX 770, the forthcoming GTX 770 Poseidon with hybrid water block and air cooler?
I don't know if I am. I don't know.
Why? It's got a water cooler built in. Excuse me. A hybrid water block.
Right. I feel like it will be the best of neither.
Oh.
Right. You know what I mean? It's like it might be a decent air cooler and it might be a decent water cooler, but it's not the best of either. So why wouldn't you pick one or the other? I mean, it's cool that it gives you flexibility to change what you're doing down the road. Right. So you can see there, it's got the water cooling barbs kind of built into it, and it's got the fan on it, and it's got that red bulge out the side that kind of makes room for everything. And it's a good looking card.
Embrace water, embrace air. Don't try to hug them both.
Yeah.
But there's room for you to be surprised, awed, and ultimately possessive about the card.
Yes. I mean, so this is. You know, if you buy water cooled cards from like EVGA and those guys, you're getting something that's like typically the advantage of it is you can put it in a 1-slot configuration and it's very thin. This just to me looks like a regular graphics card, and it just happens to have a couple of barbs coming out the top. I don't know. I'd have to see some results in terms of how much cooler is it. I think there's a quote or there's a line here in their press release. They're talking about up to 31 degrees Celsius cooler when running in the water liquid cooled mode versus the air cooled mode. So that's a huge difference if it turns out to be the case. right? And maybe you'd be able to use that to push the GK104 GPU overclocking quite a bit further. I don't know. I think it's a cool design. It's one of those things where it's going to be more expensive. I have a feeling too many people are going to buy it thinking what a great feature it will be, and they'll never use the water cooling part of it. They'd have just wasted some money when they could have bought a lower cost part. And then if you're a really hardcore water cooling guy, chances are you don't need that air fan. So why not just buy one of the 770s or 780s that has, you know, a dedicated higher end CPU water block on it? I don't know.
I think that pretty much says it all. You remain a skeptic until your skepticism is disproven, until you're proved a cynic. Actually, we're both cynics. Computex 2013 gigabyte shows off a GA990 FXA UD7 AM3 Plus motherboard that hints at 5 gigahertz, a 5 gigahertz AMD FX processor.
Yeah, so the motherboard's not exciting at all. The motherboard in this picture is not exciting at all. It's like, okay, we've seen AMD motherboards, but so it started off this kind of hunt for information yesterday when it says supports AMD next generation AM3 Plus 5 gigahertz FX series processors. So we started doing some more digging to other rumors around. And apparently there's a rumor of something called the Centurion processor that AMD has been building. It will be officially named the AMD FX 9000. And that is a 4-module, 8-core part with a 4.8 gigahertz base clock and a 5 gigahertz turbo clock speed. It would have 8 megs of L2 cache, 8 megs of L3 cache, and to go along with that, a 220 watt TDP. Which is hot, which is really, really high.
That's actually frighteningly high in this day and age.
So we had a discussion about this yesterday, right? So 220 watts is a lot. We just talked about Haswell that had an 84 watt TDP. And my guess is a quad core Haswell and this 8-core part would definitely be faster than it, but by how much, I'm not sure. 220 watts is a lot. It would require some water cooling, right? So some self-contained water cooling, something like the Corsair H100i or H110 or something like that would have to be included with this processor. They're not going to give you some kind of like stock-looking heatsink to put on something like this. But if you keep in mind, I mean, that's a lot for a processor. The GTX 770 is like a 240 watt TDP piece of silicon, right? And nobody really bats an eye at that when they're building a high-end machine. So it really all comes down to performance. I think if AMD can build a part that is exciting and interesting, it doesn't have to be, it's not going to be the most efficient, right? And it's probably not going to be the best performance per dollar. But if it's interesting and it gets people's attention, it gets people talking, I think that's good news for AMD's kind of high-end CPU world. If you're willing to buy a 220 watt part, you're not worried about cooling it. And
people aren't buying a 221 part. They're buying, 8.21 gigawatts. They're buying 5 gigahertz. They're like, I got a 5 gigahertz processor. Woo! Yeah. How you like me now? I mean, this is a part completely built around one number and 2 letters. 5G, well, 3 letters. 5GHC.
Yes.
I mean, I mean no disrespect, but in this day and age, to build a 220 watt part on that particular lineup, they are completely doing it just to either have bragging rights or to get the sales they'll get out of a 5 gigahertz part. Sorry.
I think it's both of those. For sure.
I want to give props to Western Digital. Small story this week. Western Digital has managed to stuff 1 terabyte into a 7mm 2.5-inch Western Digital Blue hard drive. So even if you have the thinnest of laptops, okay, not if you have a laptop so thin they're basically, soldering the storage down to the motherboard, but 7mm. I just thought 1 terabyte and 7mm was awesome, and I will say I am a big fan of Western Digital's new enclosure designs. They're just pretty. But holy crap, 1 terabyte, 2.5 inches, 7mm. I just thought that was awesome. If you're interested in the Xbox One, we're not going to get into it right now, but Microsoft has posted a whole bunch of announcements. I think I put them on my Twitter feed, twitter.com/Patrick Norton. NextWeb maybe was linking to them, where they're talking about the always on and some of the other issues that people have been clamoring about. This seems like another preemptive strike before E3 next week. So we can expect to be a whole lot going on at E3, both with the PlayStation and the Xbox One. Most likely, of course, Microsoft/Xbox One's redemption as a gaming platform, since everybody was really pissed off about being at such a TV and home theater box a few weeks ago. Worldwide Developer Conference starts Monday. And the predictions, pretty good collection of predictions up at 9to5mac.com. And WWDC 2013 Roundup, iOS 7, OS 10, 10.9 MacBooks, Genius-like radio app, plus new tidbits. Mark Gurman wrote that up for 9to5Mac. I think the biggest thing is obviously iOS 7 that people are waiting for, the major redesign of iOS 7, and basically just the entire taking, there's a fancy word for design that emulates things in computers that are supposed to look like things in the real world.
Scribbleism. I don't know. I had a discussion with Ken with that at lunch too, but
skeuomorphic.
Skeuomorphic. I was going to say churrascaria, but that's a Brazilian steakhouse. So
yes, which is probably much more enjoyable to eat than skeuomorphic textures. But basically, the idea is the stuff that makes bits, pixels on your screen look like real world objects is going to be beaten and squeezed and just disappeared from iOS 7.
Good.
Maps and Siri, multitasking motion. We could go on about that for a while. OS 10, 10.9, user interface updates, some critical features for power users. And if I keep scrolling someday, the big thing I think is going to be laptops, MacBooks, MacBook Airs, and MacBooks at WWDC. Quote, based on leaked SKU and pricing information, says 9to5mac.com. Apple appears set to release new versions of the MacBook Air next week. Our sources suggest that Apple will retain both MacBook Air screen sizes and ship two models of each that differ by storage and processor options. We're told that a couple of the new models could ship before others, but all four SKUs should be able to be ordered as soon as next week. So that's the question, is whether or not, I assume at this point it's going to be the announcement that they're using Haswell's new chipsets. And 802.11ac would be the other big addition on that one. So we wait with bated breath, ladies and gentlemen. If you want more rumors on WWDC, do me a favor and go over to 9to5mac.com, because they did a really, 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 really nice write-up. Cool. So man, there's so much more Computex.
I'll say
mobile processors.
Yeah, I would just say we ran into this on our podcast last night that went for like almost 2 hours, I think, and we still couldn't talk about all stuff from Computex. There's tons of people covering it. I would obviously plug myself at PCPer. If you just go to PCPer.com/Computex, you'll see like all of the hardware news that we've compiled and gathered. I didn't actually go this year, which I was fine with this time around. But if you want to, there's more on displays, there's more on the motherboards, there's more on the processors and Intel's keynotes and all that kind of stuff. So check it out. And
Gadget was there in force. The Verge was there in force. Just a lot of people. Just search Computex in Google News and you'll get about 42 million responses.
Yep.
More Xbox One and PS4 info next week. We'll probably talk about any surprises we hear from the Worldwide Developer Conference keynote. And we should take a moment to thank our beloved advertiser, our sponsor, the person, the group, the crew that's bringing this week's episode of This Week in Computer Hardware to you. Ting, ladies and gentlemen, Ting.com. The mobile company that's aiming to do things right, aiming to do things different. Actually, I'm a Ting customer, paid out of pocket. The idea is it's a no BS. I don't think I can say the other version of BS on a family-friendly show. Mobile service. They're an MNVO. They resell Sprint's nationwide service, and it's pretty cool. You own your hardware. You pay for your hardware. You bring your hardware to Ting, and then there's no contracts. There's no crazy, we're going to give you a $600 phone, and you're going to give us $3,000 or $4,000 over the next 3 years. It's really, really cool. You basically pick a package of data or minutes or text messages or some combination of all of those, and extra small through extra, extra large. And if you choose extra small and you use a large amount of data, you pay for the large amount of data. There's no punitive punishing like $42 per megabyte over your cap. There's no all of a sudden you're paying like $42 per. Apparently 42 is the number of choice for punitive text messages, but it's really cool. They have a sliding system. So you use more data, you pay a little bit more. You use less data, they basically carry over that data to the next month. It's cool. They drop you down to the next level and they credit the difference to you on your next bill. No add-on charges. You've got voicemail, you get caller ID, you get tethering, you get hotspot, you get three-way calling. You're not paying like with certain companies I could spend all day naming. It's not like, well, yes, you have unlimited data and it's going to be $35 to activate that and $35 per device and $35 to use it as a tethering device. And by the way, those are monthly charges. What? No, it's really cool. They're really, really simple and up forward. No mysterious line items on your bill. And they have a really, really nice control panel built into the accounting system. So when you're buying devices or you're changing devices, you're adding devices, it's really, really simple. You can have as many devices as you want on one plan. You can pool your minutes, your messages, and your megabytes, which is a really amazing way of saving money. And you basically pay a flat $6 per month per device on the plan. So 6 months for the device that you own, so you're not being crazy charged over months. And then you pay for the amount of data you use. They scale it up, they scale it down. Customer support's pretty good. I can vouch for that. I have called 1-855-TING-FTW. That would be for the win, not the FTW you would expect from a major carrier. They answer the phone, at least if you call them between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. EST. It was great. You know, they followed up. They sent me an email summary of what we talked about, you know, where we can go forward. Because I was trying to bring some devices onto Ting. It's really cool. And help.ting.com, their support website, works really well. So we want to invite you to check out Ting, the sponsor of Twitch, twitch.ting.com. If you go to twitch.ting.com and you sign up, not only are you going to save money and better manage your mobile phone usage, your mobile data usage, whether you need a USB thumb drive or a mini router or a new cell phone, you are going to save yourself a lot of money. Check out the savings calculator up on twitch.ting.com. And because you're a Twitch viewer, you'll be supporting the show, helping to bring Ryan and I to you each and every week. And you'll save $25 on your first Ting device when you sign up. It's a nice chunk of savings, especially if you're going for one of the less expensive phones. And if you've been sort of looking at Ting and thinking this is interesting, but I can't bring hardware, they're actually rolling out the ability to bring hardware you own onto the Ting platform. Twitch.ting.com. Check it out, people. Sign up, start saving today, and support Twitch. And Ryan and I want to thank Ting for sponsoring this episode of This Week in Computer Hardware.
Indeed.
Twitch at twit.tv is the email address. We love your questions. And our first one comes to us, well, it's kind of funny. It's an email on 4K consoles. We seem to have lost the name of who sent it, but it's a great question. Do you think that Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo are missing the boat by not going to 4K? 4K TVs are coming down in price, and Sony and Microsoft would probably love to get 4K video, or maybe they do support 4K and we just don't know it yet. No.
I think they would have said it if it did. Right? I mean, that'd be a good selling point.
You know, when 4K is like 30 to 50% of the market that they're targeting, like 30 or 50% of the homes in the United States have a 4K HD TV, man, Microsoft and Sony will be all over it. When it gets up to about 90%, Nintendo will probably still release a lower resolution version, but eventually they'll catch up if they're still around. I can't help myself but to torture Nintendo. The SD Wii just bothers me to this day. But, you know, the truth is 4K televisions, there's like 3 4K televisions you can buy, maybe 6 if you have all the money and all the time to track one down. Sure. There is no content. And next year, there will be 60 hertz and higher 4K HD TVs. So right now, you have a small group of 4K televisions, mostly running at 30 frames per second because they're running over HDMI 1.4, which does not have the bandwidth to support higher resolutions of 4K, excuse me, higher refresh rates of 4K. So no, I don't think Microsoft, Sony, or Nintendo care. The other reason is because, you know, there's just a limited pile of 4K content. It's going to be a while before that masses up. When it does, I think the consoles are going to be all over that, you know, and we may find out in 5 years that 4K kind of did what 3D is, which is to say went nowhere slowly and at modest expense.
What's kind of interesting to me is I think today that the idea that somehow consoles are missing by not supporting 4K is crazy. That's definitely not the case. But if we think that the Xbox One and the PS4 have the same life cycle as the previous consoles, we're talking 8 years.
Nope.
You do not think they will?
I don't think they will. Okay. If like,
so here's what I was going to say, because both of them are now based on x86 architectures with classic GPU architectures, I guess I'll call it, in forms of APUs. It would be it would seem to me that it'd be much more simple for them to offer an upgraded version of this console down the line that is completely backwards compatible with the previous ones, and say, okay, you know, this game will ship with the capability to be played at 1080p or 4K, depending on what hardware you have. I don't know if that's something they'd want to do, what that would create for, you know, usability issues and stuff. But I think it's, you know, there's not like they can't upgrade the Xbox One like you could with the PC, but they could offer, you know, an Xbox One 4K, right, or something like that. That
the
is
PS4K, you know, just rolls off the tongue.
There you go, right? So 3 years down the line, when an AMD APU can be built that can handle 4K resolutions and play the types of games that they want at 4K resolutions, maybe that's something they do to try to keep, you know, people interested and that kind of stuff. And that's something you can't do over streaming technology. You can't do that without having data locally, right? So which would be cool.
And look, in 4K, bandwidth may go up, but in several years, bandwidth availability may go up, and 4K over the IP, over the internet may be possible. But the short reality is that, look, textures for 4K are going to consume massive amounts of space. They're going to, and for literally like 0.0000001% of the installed user base, even in the first 6 months, I'll guess it'll be that low.
Sure.
It would be a lot of money and a lot of pain to developers to try to support 4K when there just is not enough of an installed base. But yeah, I'll be curious. Since they've gone x86, are they going to try to throttle up performance on a much faster basis? I would be really curious about that. We'll find out in like 3-4 years.
yeah. Just check back with us then.
Chris has a question about systems for IP cameras. He's a huge fan of the show. Listen to it every week. Sometimes your topics are a little over my head, but I still do enjoy listening to you. Thank you, Chris. This brings me to my question. I work for a company that sells security camera systems. Our current builds for our customers are as follows. A Asus P8Z77V, Intel Core i5-3470 socket 1155, an AMD Sapphire Radeon HD 5450, 8 gigs of DDR3 RAM, a 120 gig Samsung 840 SSD for the operating system, 3 4-terabyte enterprise Western Digital drives in RAID 5 for recorded video, a Cougar 650-watt power supply. Please, somebody make a growling noise in the chat room. Anyways, to my question, we are getting ready to switch over to the Asus Z87 Plus motherboards with the new Intel Core i5 Haswell processor. To date, the video card was sufficient for customers using IP cameras with a resolution of 1.3 to 5 megapixels per camera. Usually, on average, our customers have anywhere from 3 to 20 IP cameras, sometimes more. Sounds like Robert Heron's installing it recently. I've heard the new GPU on the Z87s are not bad and might work for our customers instead of having a separate video card. The question I have is, do you think the onboard GPU with the Z87 Plus is a better choice than using the current video card for our customer, or should we still continue to use the AMD Sapphire Radeon card for our new builds? Any idea or input you would have would help out immensely. Brian?
I guess my question is, why do they need a discrete card to begin with? Are the IP feeds being decoded in H.264 like GPU acceleration or something?
Right.
My initial guess would have been that this is a CPU limited venture in most fashions, right? So if you're attaching all these different IP cameras, handling all that video capability is probably falling on the CPU workload and not the GPU workload, would be my guess, unless the specific software that they're using and that they're installing at these customers' houses is using a GPU accelerated infrastructure of some kind. But even then, it's not CUDA based. It would have to be OpenCL based because they're using an AMD card initially. I would think that the graphics in Haswell would. It's not exactly on par with like an HD 5450. It might be closer than I think, but it's probably not going to adversely affect the performance of this particular application either. And I think the CPU improvement going from Ivy Bridge to Haswell will be a little bit better, if nothing else. So I think if nothing else, I feel like this is generic advice I give it all the time. Try it without it first. Build a test system. hook it up to some cameras and see what the user experience, what the workload feels like compared to the previous system, and then add in a card that you probably already have there. See if you notice any difference, and if you don't, boom, you don't need to add that card, and you can lower your costs going forward.
That's where I was going to immediately, is like build a box and take it to a client you like, and see what happens when you load 20 IP cameras onto it. But yeah, if there's no sort of GPU acceleration built in the application you use, I can't imagine 1080p straining even with all those video cameras going. If there is an acceleration component for the GPU, that's an entirely different bag of pixels. Yeah. Jay's got a question about laptop storage upgrades. He says, I have an HP laptop, and according to the specs, the max storage I can add is 750 gigabytes. Is there a reason why the laptop has this limitation? I wanted to add 1 terabyte of storage.
He didn't tell me. He didn't tell us what the actual version, what the model of the laptop is. I'm wondering if he is like looking up if it's an older machine where maybe only 750 gig drives existed when it was released.
That's what mobile form factor,
and that it's just like they just said up to 750 gigs because that's what they could actually offer him.
Right.
I would think if you put in a 1 terabyte 2.5-inch drive that it would probably recognize it and work just fine. But without knowing the exact, specific HP model and trying to look that kind of stuff up, I wouldn't be able to tell you. And even if I did know, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you. It'd be one of those things where you'd have to, hook it up and see what happens, see if the BIOS recognizes it. But I feel like that's just like old specifications creeping back up into the story today.
Yeah, if it's a 2.5-inch SATA-based, drive slot in there, I would be shocked if it wouldn't. If you're running a late version of Windows 7 or Windows 8, I can't imagine it wouldn't work properly. We want to talk about Ivy Bridge E and Haswell, or Haswell overclocking before we go, Ryan?
Let's do the Ivy Bridge E debate.
Nero emails about Ivy Bridge E and Haswell. He says, is it better to buy the i7 4770K or the 4930X when it comes out? They use the machine for gaming, video editing, primarily After Effects, and Hyper-V. I have a cluster of 4 Windows Server 2012 machines that will constantly move VMs based on the workload. So it is a possibility that a VM will be moved to and from the machine while gaming. That's so awesome. Does the performance increase in these areas justify the $200 plus price increase? Estimate is based on a 3770K to a 3930X. System specs, either a 4770K or a 4930X, 32 gigabytes. That is 4 by 8 gigabytes of RAM. Yes! A 256 gigabyte OCZ Agility 4, 500 plus 500 plus 750 gigabyte HDDs. That would be hard disk drives. And a GeForce 660 Ti. Man, off the top of my head, I'm going to immediately say buy the cheap board and processor.
So, we should point out he's talking about a part that doesn't even exist yet. The 4930X. If Intel were to follow the same naming conventions that they've used with Sandy Bridge E, with Ivy Bridge E, would be a 6-core, 12-thread part of some kind, triple channel memory controller.
Bag of awesome, I think is what you're thinking.
Right. So, it's interesting because this time around, instead of Sandy Bridge versus Sandy Bridge E, it's Ivy Bridge E, the previous generation microarchitecture, versus Haswell, the 4th generation microarchitecture. And if the price differences are about the same, you're jumping from a 4-core to a 6-core part, 8 threads to 12 threads. Right. You're going from a dual channel to a triple channel memory controller.
And suddenly I want the 4930X.
Right. So he's talking about gaming, video editing, and Hyper-V, and now he's talking about moving virtual machines around while gaming. Now I'm thinking
this being moved onto his system in the background while gaming.
Yeah, and now you're like, okay, if there was ever kind of a reason for high-end components to exist, this kind of sounds like one of those, right? So I would say, if both parts existed today, I would go with the 4930X, everything being as he laid it out. The problem is the 4930X is not out, and we have no idea when it will actually be out. Right. I just, it's if I thought it was going to be out in a month or two, I'd say go ahead and wait. But if it doesn't come out until the winter time, it all depends on what his upgrade schedule is. He doesn't really say what he has now, right? Doesn't really.
I suspect what he has now is probably fairly badass. But how about this, Nero? If you can wait wait for the 4930X because it's going to be a monster and it's going to make your life better and your gaming better with all of your virtual machines dancing on the tips of pins, the head of a pin, the you know what I mean. And yeah, if any, like the only way this could be more obnoxious in terms of actually using all of your CPU's capabilities if he was like rendering video while gaming and the possibility of a virtual machine being moved onto the system in the background. This is a really serious power user situation. So Nero, if you can wait, get the 4930X, and if not, you should be pretty happy with the 4770K at this point. Information on Haswell laptop performance, when we can get our grubby little paws on a Haswell laptop to benchmark. Intel claims 50%. We are not holding our breath while we're waiting, but we are both excited to see what the performance difference is, and we may know as soon as Monday. Well, you know, after they were sued into a corner over iPod battery issues, our friends at Apple have been very conservative about their battery estimates, so I wouldn't be surprised if they announce that Haswell-based laptops tomorrow that the battery estimates are fairly accurate. For everybody in the chat room who's been talking about backups of your data, look, kids, 1 is none, 2 is 1, 3 is better. Is a really good way of putting it. And if you have 2 copies, you'd have 1 locally, and if you can put 1 out on the cloud in an offsite storage system, that's a really, really good idea in case your house gets burned down or flooded or tornadoed or stormed or, you know, burnt or beaten or stolen. Having a copy of your data offsite could be a business saver, a life saver, or just a collection of your favorite pictures saver. And there's nothing wrong with protecting your favorite pictures. PC Per, more fallout from Computex, or are you guys just going to move straight into the 22,000 Z87 motherboard options next week?
There will probably be a couple more Computex stories that find their way out. I think the show officially ended tomorrow, but it's tomorrow already there, I think. I don't know. It might have ended already. It's very different being over here on this side, 12 hours away from the show, which is not usual for me. We'll have whatever is left of Computex coverage up on the site. We'll have Z87 reviews up on the site. We have some more Ivy Bridge, Haswell, Sandy Bridge E kind of comparison testing coming as well. And then I'm really, really, really trying to get that Asus 4K display in here by like next week. For personal reasons and professional reasons, of course. But that's the goal. That's the goal.
How much is that monitor going to cost?
Well, I mean, it's $4,000 or something like that.
It's a write-off.
But I want to see.
We'll advertise it over 3 years.
Let's compare it to that $1,300 TV I bought. Yeah.
Well, yeah, which is behind the LG that's being reviewed right now behind me. AC Nation. We're finally going to get AC Nation up on the RSS feed, back up at revision3.com/AC Nation. That's coming. But we've got a review of LG's new home theater in a box. And we actually recently did Panasonic's ST60, which is a fantastic bargain in a plasma. And if you're kind of all about LEDs and not plasma, you really should give plasmas a second look, especially the ST60. It is a phenomenal picture for the money. You can find that up on youtube.com/textfeed and scroll down for the AC Nation episodes. We're going to be getting a little hands-on with the Raspberry Pi again next week. We found we're going to tell you how to add additional distros to the bootloader we've been using on Raspberry Pi. We've got some wireless hard drive add-ons for mobile devices. So if you want a terabyte to carry around with you, and you can't put a terabyte in your phone or your tablet, we're going to have a workaround for that. And there's something else really big going on. Oh, yeah, E3 coverage. Rev3 Games is down there. And Michael, RAP is being borrowed by Rev3 Games to help them produce content down there. So Michael's going to be reporting on the big announcements from E3. E3 is going to be interesting. Xbox One, PS4. You know, the what was the last article up on PC Per? The one that
the DRM, the Microsoft DRM stuff.
No. The Unreal Engine 4 Partners Program.
Oh, yeah.
Unreal Engine 4, and it's like 4,000 partners that are aiming to blow your eyeballs out of your face in a cool way. Yeah, I think it's going to be just a once in a lifetime E3. So if you're into gaming, it's going to be a big E3 next week, and we look forward to every single moment of it. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this edition of This Week in Computer Hardware. I'm Patrick Norton.
I'm Ryan Shrout.
We'll see you next week on Twitch.